let's talk about this speech made by the former president of Russia and a top Putin ally. Now, when I say top Putin ally, people know that Dmitry Medvedev, who is head of the Russian Security Council, that's his current position, but he's held many other Russian government positions and will probably hold others as time goes on. He is somebody who's been close to Putin. People know that, but let me try to get this through how close he is to Putin. I have watched like really old Russian, and I was just doing a dive on Putin. Old Putin footage, and the further and further I go back, Dmitry Medvedev is always there as long as Putin's been in power. And I kept digging and I went all the way back to like footage from 1999. I was watching some old DW documentary on Putin's campaign for president in like the late 1990s, when he was taking the role from Yeltsin. And wouldn't you know it, every single person in that campaign office was not there. All of them had left. Either they had died, or they had fled the country, they had fallen out of favor, or something else. Except for one. And that one person was Dmitry Medvedev. And he's the only person since Putin has come into power who has also served in the position of president of Russia. And I know that Dmitry Medvedev has a reputation. And it's very easy for us to just completely go like, it's Medvedev, and hand wave what he has to say. I understand that Medvedev the drunkard is the reputation. And we should not take his words as if they were Putin's words. We should not take his words as if it was the exact doctrine of the Russian state. But we cannot completely dismiss it, since he is somebody who still serves in the Russian government. He is somebody who has been president of Russia and was president of Russia less than 10 years ago. And he is still a very close Putin ally. And while people talk about the post-Putin era, it's very difficult for anybody to choose who would come after Putin. He is always on that short list. I'm not saying that he will be the next leader of Russia. I'm not saying that he even has particularly great chances of being the next president of Russia. It's just that since he was president of Russia and has been close to Putin for well over 20 years now, and he was with him on his first campaign, and he's still in there and in the Russian government, and he survived all this time, when people talk about who could be the next president of Russia, Medvedev is up there. Now, why he is up there on that list is kind of hard to say. A lot of people say Putin wants his lackeys kind of fighting with each other so they don't concentrate on him. And so this is just kind of a, he's going to keep it so nobody can predict who would come next, so they concentrate on fighting with each other instead of him. It's impossible to say. But my point is, even if he is a drunkard, or if he has the reputation of a drunkard, who cares? At the end of the day, he still has ties to the Russian government, deep ties that go back a while. He is still in the Russian government. He's a former president of Russia. And when people talk about who could be the next president of Russia after Putin kicks the bucket, he has on the very least on the board. Not saying that he has a great chance of winning, but he's on the board. So Medvedev gave a speech recently in Russia where he said a lot of things, but it all was around the general theme that Ukraine is Russia, and that they need to take all these historical territories either into Russia's direct ownership or into their strategic ownership. For example, they have a puppet government in Kiev controlling Ukraine, so Ukraine works for their strategic interests. So it either works, and we've talked about this on the channel before, Ukraine is either a part of Russia or it is an extension of Russia. Those are the only two options that Medvedev lays out in this speech. He goes even further to say this. Now, you can go check the translations yourself. I've also had them checked out to make sure they were okay, and I was told that they're accurate. This is Medvedev saying that Ukraine is Russia, doesn't really exist, and it will be taken. Look at this. One of the former leaders of Ukraine once said Ukraine is not Russia.
Сказал, что Украина это не Россия. Вот эта
This is a concept that should disappear forever. Ukraine is definitely Russia. Now, there's a few other things that I wanted to say that he said during the speech that I'm going to read quick before we move on to the last part of this that I want to point out. So Medvedev said a few other things in the speech. We're not going to take the time to watch the entire speech. So I wanted to read you a few other things that Medvedev said One second. Medvedev, who the West once saw as a liberal reformer, said that Russia's geostrategic space was indivisible from Ukraine and that any attempt to change that by force was doomed. All our adversaries need to understand once and for all a simple fact, that the territories on both banks of the Dnieper River, which bisects Ukraine, are an integral part of Russia's strategic and historical borders. This is what I was talking about earlier. This is the same thing we've been talking about for a while on the channel. The Russian establishment believes, whether it's Putin himself, Medvedev, Russian nationalists, it is those who control the levels of power in Russia, believe that for Ukraine to exist, and this is what Putin said at the start of this war, it either has to exist as part of Russia, that means annexed as part of Russia itself under the Russian constitution, as they have tried to annex Crimea, Donetsk, Luhansk, Zaporizhia, and Kherson, or it has to be indirectly, strategically a part of Russia, in the way that Belarus might right now be called strategically part of Russia, and Russia is working in the long term to make it just part of Russia, period. Whether through how we're seeing what's happening to the Belarusian language as it starts to fade with time, and the Belarusian government does absolutely nothing to preserve it, with the Belarusian government almost having like an open disdain for its own tongue, and other ways of integrating it more with Russia. For example, Russian citizens can now vote in Belarusian elections. And so that's a way of maybe Belarus in the future will be directly part of Russia, but it is at the very least right now strategically part of Russia. And so this is Medvedev reaffirming what we've believed and what we've had good reason to believe has been Russia's goal since the very beginning, and has been their stated goal from the very beginning. Medvedev ruled out peace talks with the current Ukrainian leadership. He said any future Ukrainian government that wanted talks would need to recognize what he called the new reality. Commenting on East-West relations, Medvedev said ties between Moscow and Washington were now worse than during the 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis, when the two countries appeared on the brink of nuclear conflict. Now, this is something he did regularly during the entirety of this war, beating his chest about nuclear threats. He is not the person who would make such a decision. He is somebody who probably has some amount of, or I would even say a large amount of insider knowledge of what's going on in the Russian government, but he has particularly been very, I would say, loud about the fact that they have a nuclear arsenal. I will say one bitter thing, he said. The current situation is much worse than in 1962. This is a fully fledged war against Russia with American weapons and with the participation of American special forces and American advisor. That's how it is. We did the same thing in Afghanistan, and they did the same thing in Vietnam. I just want to throw that out there, that there have been other instances between 1962 or other instances, which of course not 100% one-to-one comparable. There's been instances where we have shuffled weapons to people fighting Russian soldiers and killing Russian soldiers, and there have been instances where the Russians have done the same to us. Hell, they've even tested their weapons on us, on our soldiers in Vietnam. Anyway, continuing. One of Ukraine's former... Oh, we already read this. Anyway, I went through all of this, and there's a few conclusions I came to. Number one, my first conclusion is that for Medvedev, and probably I would also say, and this is something that I don't think is just confirmed by what Medvedev says, but from Russian action on the ground, is that the Russians probably do not want to stop, almost certainly do not want to stop with what they have now. If they have a choice, they want to take more. And I think the most pertinent piece of evidence, I could point towards Russian government statements, I could point towards this Medvedev speech as he talks about both sides of the Dnieper River. And for those of you who aren't familiar, when he says both sides of the Dnieper River, he is saying that not only do the Russians believe they have claims to all of this across the river, but he believes, which this is it right here, the Dnieper River, he believes, and this is across it, he believes they have rights to the other side. But the most pertinent piece of evidence is the fact that they lost, at the very least, according to the MERS data, 17,000 soldiers to take a city of 30,000 in Avdiivka. That's not including the wounded. That's just the dead. And the 300 armored vehicles, according to the MERS data, which is, there's a good chance is an underestimate. And they're continuing the push, losing more and more and more and more people. And they're pushing despite the fact that the equipment losses and the personnel losses might not be replaceable 2-3 years down the line. Now, if they're spending, I think pre-war 2022, they were spending 1.3 million rubles on the military. No, I think it was, they were spending 5.3 million rubles billion rubles every year. And now they're spending 1.3 billion rubles every month on the armed forces. Now, of course, some of that is inflationary spending. And they're, have to deal with the fact that, the ruble has gone down in value, but they have really, really massively increased the military spending. They have massively increased the amount of soldiers they're losing. They've massively increased the cost of their own economy. And I think that the Russians are viewing it like, we just put all this on the table. We can't just walk away with a little bit. We need to walk away with a lot to make this worthwhile. And Vladimir Putin's intentions, I don't think, have really changed. Now, whether or not he can fulfill those intentions, I don't think they've changed. So for the people who I think are saying like, oh, Ukraine is fine, it doesn't need the equipment because, the Russians obviously are not performing that well, or, oh, well, the Russians are probably satisfied with what they have now, so let's just make a deal. It seems to me, at the very least, to ignore the reality on the ground, which is the Russians are willing to take massive losses, equipment-wise and personnel-wise, to take advantage of the current Ukrainian ammo shortage to push. And so in my mind, balancing both Russian government public statements with what they're doing on the ground leads me to believe that at the very least, they want to take the rest of Donetsk, Luhansk, and possibly take back Kherson, since they announced that's their annexation as well. If they can, and of course, this would also include the city of Zaporizhia. Now, whether or not they can accomplish that, that would be an extremely militarily difficult task, just like the capture of Kramatorsk, Luhansk, and all these locations. That's another thing. But they're still trying to advance towards that goal. Why else would they be taking these massive casualties on the front line to keep advancing if they didn't want to take more land or negotiate all this land away at some negotiating table? Now, I want to show you guys, before we wrap up this segment, the map that Dmitry Medvedev was standing in front of during this speech he was giving. So in this map, he didn't explicitly say this is what we're aiming for. It seems to be a map that they showed to show the possible future deconstruction of Ukraine under maybe, I don't know if it would be a Medvedev plan or if it would be just generally what they're aiming for, but this is the map they displayed when they were talking about the future of Ukraine. And as you can see, the Russians have Luhansk, Donetsk, Zaporizhia, Kherson, Crimea, Kharkiv, Sumy, Cherniv, Poltava, Cherkasy, Dnipro, Odessa. I mean, there's more, basically everything that is Ukraine, all the way up to Kiev, which, even though they give them one city, a single oblast where they might be able to keep their country, it still has to be named the Russian way, of course, because Russian demands from the very start of the war was to put the Ukrainian and Russian language on the same level in Ukrainian, in whether it be in Ukrainian education or Ukrainian civil society, Ukrainian government, and public documents. But on the other end of this, you can see Romania also annexes Ukrainian land. They annex Vinica. I know people from this. Dennis, from my recent artillery documentary, he's from here, so I guess he's going to be Romanian now. And Poland. I know people who live in these areas as well. Lviv and all these other Western Ukrainian provinces. I know people who live in that area. I guess they're all going to be Polish. I guess my friend Dima's going to be Russian. All this is going to be going to Russia. All this is going to Poland, Romania. This is completely delusional. This is never going to happen. This is never going to happen for a lot of reasons. Number one, Poland is not going to take any part of Ukraine. Number two, Romania is not going to take any part of Ukraine. And number three, as much as I want to emphasize that the Ukrainians are dealing with an ammunition shortage right now, the Russians lost 17,000 men, many more injured, trying to take Avdiivka, a city of 30,000. For frame of reference, Kharkiv is a city of, I believe, 1.4 million, of course, pre-war. So 30,000 to 1.4 million when it comes to the type of urban combat or offensive power or military might Russia would need in order to enforce these types of demands. Obviously, they cannot sustain this type of an attack on all of Ukraine to take all this land outside of it being partitioned with Western powers and the West completely abandoning Ukraine, which is why Romania and Poland in this scenario is also getting land. So this scenario, the odds of something like this, of course, I think are quite low. And I think this is possibly fear-mongering, a way to rally the Russian public into what they could do, the empire they could build. But I do want to put forward that if the Russians could accomplish this, they would. And they'd take it, and they'd keep it, and be happy about it, and they would enforce it with blood and iron. And if Medvedev could enforce this, then Medvedev would. And internally, and I know Perun was talking about this recently in his most recent video, talking about the war economy and the state of the war. From Medvedev's angle, his logic makes sense. And I'm not saying that to say he's right. It's just from his Russian nationalist angle, his logic makes sense. If the threat for Russia comes from Kiev, then just taking Luhansk, Donetsk, Zaporizhia, Kherson, just taking these territories, coming to some compromise that allows it to survive, doesn't eliminate the threat. The threat continues to exist. So if you had to make the eternal logic of the Russian war effort survive, if you want that logic to make sense or convince anyone, then it has to be that the Ukrainians were a threat to the Russians, and if they're a threat to the Russians, the war cannot end until that threat is destroyed. Therefore, Ukraine as an entity needs to be destroyed. Now, is this practically achievable right now? No, it is not practically achievable right now. But if we abandon the Ukrainians, do you not think the Russians would try everything to get the best that they could, the closest that they could to something like this? Absolutely. And it would be extremely brutal, extremely horrible, and it would probably mean decades and decades of occupation for the Ukrainian people, if not more. And so as much as this seems like fantasy land and seems like something that got cooked up at the Gonzalo Lira meth house, it does show at least a very, very, very bad intentions for Ukraine, and that those intentions of taking up and carving Ukraine and taking what they can is still there. Medvedev made a very interesting wardrobe choice. Oh yeah, you're right. Actually, I didn't mention this. Oh God, did I have the picture up? I had the picture somewhere. I could have sworn I saved this picture of Medvedev. I have it on my Twitter. I can just pull it up. Honestly, you're saying he reminds you of Kim Jong-un. I got a different impression from this. You know what he reminds me of? Oh God, you guys are gonna hate me for this. I'm sorry, man. But it's true. It's true. I'm sorry. It's true. It's true. And I don't like that it's true, but I'm just being honest. Okay. I have to cover the news as the news is. I'm sorry. I'm sorry, but I have to bring the truth to you. It's all connected. It's all connected. Don't let them lie to you. Don't let them lie to you. It's all connected.